Adonai Tzevaot Imanu Miskav Lanu Elohei Yaakov Selah Adonai Tzevaot Ashrei Adam Boteach Bach Adonai Hoshia HaMelech Yaneinu Beyom Koreinu La Yehudim Haita Ora V'Simcha V'Sason V'Ikar Ken Tielanu Kos Yeshuot Esau V'Shem Adonai Ekra
That was Josh Warshawski doing Havdalah. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? A good Vach, Shavua Tov, a good week to you. Let's get it started right by lighting up the darkness. All right. Who is with us as we start the week with some beautiful learning on a Saturday night? John in Maine, Christo in Lubbock, Melissa in Great Neck, Pam in Nashville, Sandra in Las Vegas, Jim in Newport, Rochelle in Seaside, Oregon, Brian in San Diego, and John in Surfside Beach, South Carolina, burning the midnight oil. All you East Coasters, very well done. Paul in Minneapolis, and John likes the bell. Over there on the YouTube side, still awaiting. Okay, first a quick story. So this past week, a great tzaddik died, a really, really righteous person named Reb Yoel Kahn. He was very well known in the Chabad community. He had a massive, massive intellect and it was a genius at explaining Hasidic concepts. Also, when the Lubavitcher Rebbe was alive, and he would often teach for hours on Shabbos and holidays, and they really wanted to capture what he said, but of course they couldn't record it or film it on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So there were certain individuals who had this gift for hearing something once and being able to tell it over again and write it down and really get the gist of what the Rebbe was saying. And Reb Yoel was kind of the original guy doing that work, and he headed that work for many, many, many years. He was also just a very, very big-hearted individual. And the story I want to tell you was given over today by Rav Yekusiel Kalmanson here at our Minyan. With respect to, in today's Torah portion, we read the Ten Commandments, right? So the Ten Commandments are given twice in the Torah. The second time here in the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses is recounting everything that the Israelites experienced during their 40 years. It's his final words of instruction, of law, of advice, counsel, and storytelling, recounting the journeys. Moses is not going to be able to enter the Holy Land with the people, and he's really giving them all he can before they go. And so part of it, of course, is recounting the Ten Commandments. Now, the Ten Commandments were written on 2 tablets of stone, and those stones have a history. The Midrash tells us, the rabbinic literature tells us, that those same 2 stones that would end up having the Ten Commandments carved on them were originally the stones back in the book of Genesis that when Jacob had to flee from Esau, his brother wanted to kill him because Jacob took the birthright. At a certain moment he was alone in the desert, and he was scared and alone, running from home, going to an uncertain future, really scared. And he went to sleep, and he arranged some stones, plural, by his head. He lay his head on them, and then when he awoke, his head was on a stone. And in between, he dreamed of this ladder going up to heaven and the angels descending and ascending and descending. And the Midrash tells us that the stones recognized that this was an incredibly holy person, right? Jacob, whose name would eventually be changed to Israel, and we are all the children of Israel, at least the Jews are. And the stones argued over who would have the right to be under his head. And a miracle was performed, and the two stones became one. The two stones became one overnight, and they both had that privilege of lying under the tzaddik's head, under Jacob's head. Why does this matter? Eventually, those stones split, or were split. Perhaps Moses, God carved the original stones of the Ten Commandments. But at any rate, the one stone became two tablets. Now, the first tablet describes the obligations of a human toward God, right? I am the Lord your God. I brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods beside me. You will not carve the image of a god, etc. You shall keep Shabbos. That's all in the first tablet. Also honor your father and mother, which you would think is obligations to other people, but in honoring our parents, we honor God. The second tablet is all about our obligations to other people. You shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet what they have, no illicit sex, etc. They're separate stones, right? But the teaching is that both stones are one, and that if you love God, you will love his creatures. And by loving the creatures, you show love for God. You shouldn't think that there's two separate realms, my religious life, my prayer life, but then when I go out among the people, it's a dog-eat-dog world. It's all one world. And so when we treat people with kindness and respect and fulfill our proper moral obligations toward other people, we thereby honor God. So this story about Reb Yoel Kahn, in addition to his duties at 770 Eastern Parkway, transcribing the Rebbe's lectures, etc., and then after the Rebbe died, he had many other duties, and he was just a great, great teacher and a gifted writer. And he would also travel and give talks. And so one time he was on the road, and his driver needed to make a pit stop and use the men's room. So the driver explained, he said, Reb Yoel said, of course, please pull over. They pulled over. The guy found a rest stop, went in, used the bathroom. They were probably a little bit late where they were going. He rushed back to the car and wanted to get going right away. And Reb Yoel said, wait a minute, did you purchase something in the establishment? He said, no, I just used the bathroom. He says, well, you use the facilities of this person who owns that store and rest stop, etc. It's inappropriate to use the facilities without patronizing the establishment. Just a very simple story, but really, zeroes in on the way we should treat people. This is somebody they never even met, we're probably never going to see again in their lives, had nothing to do with being a Jew, probably not a Jew. But if you use somebody's establishment to go to the bathroom, you buy something while you are there. And that is a way of honoring God by honoring the creatures, by honoring the people whom God has created. That's a Reb Yoel story that I heard today, worth noting on the day we read the Ten Commandments, standing up, of course, in Shul. When we came out of Shabbos, I also heard, very sadly, let me get this in front of me, we lost a great, great comedian and a great Yid, a great Jew today, Jackie Mason, at 93 years old. Absolutely broke the mold. Some people think, that humor was old-fashioned, that Borscht Belt humor. I mean, he invented so much of that humor, and he kept it going and kept it popular long after that style was replaced by other styles of comedy. My father-in-law, Jaime, just loved Jackie Mason, had all kinds of Jackie Mason quotes ready to go at a moment's notice. And I just thought I would read to you a few lines of Jackie Mason's. This is just his one-liners. Did you know that the Jews invented sushi? That's right. 2 Jews bought a restaurant with no kitchen. My grandfather always said, don't watch your money, Watch your health. So one day while I was watching my health, someone stole my money. It was my grandfather. This is a classic. It's easy to tell the difference between Jews and Gentiles. After you go to a show, all the Gentiles are saying, have a drink, want a drink, let's have a drink. While the Jews are saying, have you eaten yet? Let's eat. You want a piece of cake? Let's get a piece of cake. He says, I always thought music was more important than sex. But then I thought if I don't hear a concert for a year and a half, it doesn't bother me so much. It's no longer a question of staying healthy. It's a question of finding a sickness you like. He was ahead of his time there. He said, Jackie Mason said, why is it that they have Bibles in every motel room? Why should a man want to read the Bible when he's with a woman alone in a motel room? Why would he be interested? Whatever he's praying for, he's already got it. He says, I talk to myself because I like dealing with a better class of people. All right, we miss you, Jackie Mason. Thank you for entertaining the whole world with so much humor and grace for so many years. There will never be another Jackie Mason, and we miss you. Okay. Right. Let's get to today's daf. Where are we holding? This is Daf Yud Zayin, page 17 here in Tractate Sukkah. These are the laws of Sukkot. This is the 7th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 1 of 5. This chapter deals primarily with the Sukkah itself, that booth in which we're commanded to dwell during the festival holiday, the fall festival, Sukkot. And we've been talking about all the requirements of the sukkah, and we've learned that the primary requirement, the main thing of the sukkah, the walls have certain requirements, but really it's about the roofing, right? The roofing. It has to be plant matter that grew from the ground, that's no longer attached to the ground. It has to let in more, it has to have more shade than sunlight, but it still has to pass some sunlight. It has to be less than 20 cubits over the ground and more than 10 handbreadths. The sukkah has a minimum area of 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths. It can be as big as you want to make it. Now, Mishnah number 11. If one distanced the roofing, the schach, from the walls of the sukkah at a distance of 3 handbreadths, the sukkah is unfit because 3 handbreadths of open space, even adjacent to the walls, render the sukkah unfit. So now what we're talking about is it has to let in more sunlight than shade. But if you have an actual hole in the roof that's 3 handbreadths or more, so then that roofing is unfit and the sukkah is going to be unfit. You can have gaps, you must have gaps so that sunlight can pass through, but those gaps can't be more than 3 handbreadths, right? So about that much. Those openings can't be more than 3 handbreadths, nor can you have an opening running the whole length of one side of the sukkah of 3 handbreadths. And that's kind of unusual because it's like if something is within 3 handbreadths of something else, we've seen that concept of lavud. So you'd think if the roofing is within 3 handbreadths of the wall, it's going to count. And I guess it will if it's less than 3 handbreadths. But the reason it's unusual is because if you have unfit roofing, 4 cubits even at the edge of the wall, at the edge of the sukkah, touching the wall, the sukkah is still going to be okay using this principle of the wall curves up, the curved wall. So even if you're using material that's not fit for a sukkah, like for example metal rods, it could extend 4 cubits away from the edge of the roof to that wall. And like you can't, eat, sleep, or eat under that part of the sukkah. That part of the sukkah is not a valid sukkah. But it doesn't render the whole sukkah unfit as long as the part that's under the valid roofing is large enough to be a sukkah. And we just assume that it's like the wall curved over before it met the roof. However, if there's nothing there, if it's just a gap, a space where you look straight up through it, then even if as soon as it reaches 3 handbreadths, it's going to render the whole sukkah unfit. In the case of a house that was breached, creating a hole in the middle of the roof, and one roofed over the breach, right? So you have a house, okay, it wasn't built to be a sukkah. It can't be a sukkah because it has a ceiling. But now there's a hole in the ceiling in the middle of the house. Can you put proper roofing material for a sukkah over that hole and turn it into a sukkah? And one roofed over the breach, if from the wall to the roofing there are 4 or more cubits of the remaining original roof, it is an unfit sukkah. If the roofing is less than 4 cubits from the wall, the sukkah is fit based on the principle of the curved wall. And the remaining intact ceiling is considered an extension of the vertical wall. And likewise, in the case of a courtyard that is surrounded on 3 sides by a portico, which has a roof but no wall. So it's like you have an L-shaped house, right? If you're looking down over it, and then there's just some kind of portico over the courtyard, the 3-sided courtyard, just made by the C-shaped house. Where's my? Oh, here. Right. So if your house was kind of shaped like that, and in this courtyard, so these are the rooms of the house over there. This is just an open courtyard. And so let's say you had some kind of a ceiling over this courtyard, not necessarily, but it's not attached to the house. The ceiling here, this portico, has its own pillars that are holding it up. So can we, now it's a portico, it's some kind of a ceiling that's probably not the kind of material that is appropriate for schach, for roofing of a sukkah. But can you turn this thing into a sukkah is the question. So if the house, in the case of a courtyard that is surrounded on 3 sides by a portico, which has a roof but no walls, so if one placed roofing over the courtyard, now we're talking about roofing for a sukkah, so proper schach, let's say palm branches, palm leaves. So if one placed over the courtyard between the different sides of the portico and the roof of the portico is 4 cubits wide, the sukkah is unfit, right? So what you have is like, this is the house, right? With its, rooms, etc. Maybe the front door is here. Okay. And then you have this portico in the courtyard. That's not proper roofing. Okay, but then you're going to replace it with proper roofing, right? Like branches of schach. And so then the question is, well, what is this gap between the walls of the house, which are now going to be considered the walls of the sukkah, right? This gap has to be less than 3 handbreadths if it's just empty space, or if it's going to be filled with the what was, right, the roofing, the portico material. Like imagine if it was some kind of like canvas that you were using as the portico of your courtyard. That, as long as it's touching the walls of the house, that could be up to 4 cubits in width, and it would still be a valid sukkah under the proper roofing of the sukkah. And this portico material, let's say it's canvas, that would be considered like the curved wall of the house walls, which are now forming the walls of the sukkah. And the principle of curved wall does not apply to unfit roofing that measures more than 4 cubits, right? So the curved wall will only work for 4 cubits extending away from the wall. It's not proper roofing. It's considered like the wall that just curves over, but there needs to be something there. If it's just empty space, then it has to be no more than 3 handbreadths. The Gemara. The Gemara asks, why do I need all these cases based on the same principle of the curved wall? And the Gemara explains, it is necessary to cite all the cases as if the Mishna had taught us only the case of the house that was breached, a hole in the roof of a house, and that you're going to try to replace that hole with proper schach for the sukkah. If it had only taught that case, I would have said that the principle of curved wall applies there because those walls were established for the house. Therefore, when the house is transformed into a sukkah, the walls continue to serve their original function as walls of the sukkah. However, with regard to a courtyard, which is surrounded on each of the three sides by a portico, where its walls were not established for the portico, but rather for the house that happens to surround the portico, and now we're trying to turn that whole courtyard space into a sukkah. So I might have thought that those walls, which are really the exterior walls of another structure than the sukkah, wouldn't work with the curved wall principle, and the Mishnah tells us that they do work with the curved wall principle as long as they are attached to that portico covering, that canvas in our example. And if the Mishnah taught us only these two cases, one would have said that the principle of curved wall can apply because all of their roofing is fit roofing, and the pre-existing roof of the house and the portico is unfit only due to the principle, prepare it, and not from that which has already been prepared. However, here in the case of a large sukkah that was surrounded at the edge of its roofing with material with which one may not roof a sukkah, where some of its roofing is unfit and the fit roofing does not actually reach the wall, one could say, no, the roofing is unfit, and therefore it was necessary to state that case as well. In other words, the Mishnah taught us three cases because each of the three cases teaches a unique lesson. Rabbah said, I found the sages of the school of Rav who were sitting and saying in the name of Rav, space without roofing renders the sukkah unfit with a measure of 3 handbreadths of space. However, unfit roofing renders the sukkah unfit with a measure of 4 handbreadths. Now that's a little bit surprising because didn't we just learn, oh, wait a minute, if it's an empty space, okay, 3 handbreadths. If you just get a gap of 3 handbreadths or more, that's going to render the roofing unfit and the sukkah unfit. But when we're talking about there is something there, it's just not proper material for the roof, okay, it can be as much as 4 cubits from the edge of the wall, and we still get the curved wall concept. So why is the Gemara now talking about 4 handbreadths rather than 3 handbreadths for the gap or 4 cubits for the edge? So why are these sages of the school of Rav talking about a measure of 4 handbreadths for the unfit roofing? And I said to them, Rabbah said, and I said to them, from where do you derive that space renders the sukkah unfit when it amounts to 3 handbreadths? It is as we learn in the Mishnah. If one distanced the roofing from the walls of the sukkah at a distance of 3 handbreadths, the sukkah is unfit. Well, if indeed this Mishnah is the source of the halacha, also in the case of unfit roofing, let it render the sukkah unfit only if the roofing measures 4 cubits, as we learned in the Mishnah, with regard to a house that was breached and one roofed over the breach. If from the walls to the roofing there is more than 4 cubits of the remaining original roof, the sukkah is unfit. So where are you getting this thing about unfit roofing once you get 4 handbreadths? It's going to render the sukkah unfit. And the sages of the school of Rav said to me, cite proof from the Mishnah apart from this case. As both Rav and Shmuel said that in this case, the sages in the Mishnah touched upon the principle of a curved wall. In other words, the fact that this house is a fit sukkah is unrelated to the minimum measure of unfit roofing. It is fit due to the principle of a curved wall. So what we're learning here is that okay, you can have unfit roofing along the edge of the roof that touches the wall, and you can have as much as 4 cubits of it, right? A cubit is like this, so this is about 6 feet of unfit roofing under the principle of the wall just curves over, becomes horizontal, but we haven't actually reached the roof of the sukkah yet until we get to the fit roofing. However, once you're in the area that is the roof and not the curved wall, unfit roofing, some material that is mixed in and which is not going to qualify as proper schach, it's going to render the roofing unfit with a measure of 4 handbreadths. And now we remember that when we were talking about placing wooden beams up there, and then there was a dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. I think it was a 3-way dispute. And they said that a beam which is 4 handbreadths wide is okay as long as in between the beams or in between the boards you're going to have proper roofing, right? So the wooden board that's up to 4 handbreadths wide, certainly less than if it's a shade less than 4 a hair less than 4 handbreadths wide is definitely going to be okay, and possibly even at 4 handbreadths is going to be okay. Now they're saying at 4 handbreadths, that's it. Unfit roofing, that's part of the sukkah roof. Once it's 4 handbreadths wide, it's going to render it unfit. This is the sages of the school of Rav. And I said to them, Rabbah said to them, well, what if there is a sukkah with less than 4 handbreadths of unfit roofing and an adjacent space, like a gap with no roofing at all, of less than 3 handbreadths? What would be the status of the sukkah? So the question that Rabbah is asking the sages of the school of Rav, let me just make a figure here. Okay, something like this. All right, so imagine that you're looking down onto the roof of a sukkah here. And, where like most of it is proper roofing. Let's say it's made out of palm branches or bamboo or whatever. And then there's a space in the middle, which is really a joining of 2 spaces. This one, which I say is 2.5 handbreadths wide, is just empty space. And this one is made out of, let's say, a metal grating. So it's unfit roofing because it's made out of metal. And that is 3.5 handbreadths wide. So it's neither the 4 handbreadths that's needed for unfit roofing to make the sukkah unfit, not valid, nor in terms of a gap where there's nothing at all, it's not 3 handbreadths, which would render the sukkah unfit. So what Rabbah is asking is, does the empty space and the unfit, in this case metal roofing, combine 2.5 and 3.5 is 6, right? So 6 handbreadths is definitely more than the minimum measure of even the more lenient measure, which is the measure of unfit roofing, which more than 4 handbreadths would render the sukkah unfit. This is now 6 handbreadths wide of something that is no good for a sukkah roof, a combination of empty space and metal. Do those combine to make up the minimum to render the sukkah unfit? That's the question he's asking them. And they said to me, wait a minute. So that's the question. And they said the sukkah would be fit since it lacks the minimum measure of either space, empty space, which is 3 handbreadths, or unfit roofing, which is 4 handbreadths. If one filled the space with skewers, what would be the status of the sukkah? Then it would be unfit. If that whole combination space, if you put metal grating in here in what was the empty space, well, then you would have something 6 handbreadths across that definitely would render the sukkah unfit. But before you do that, you have an empty one of 2.5 and a metal one of 3.5. And so Rav is saying, why wouldn't they combine to render the sukkah unfit? And the sages of the school of Rav said, well, they don't combine because they're different. They're different in nature. This is empty space, and it renders the sukkah unfit for its reason. And this is metal skewers, unfit roofing, and it renders the sukkah unfit for its reason. And you don't combine those 2 things together. And so Rabbah says to them, but shouldn't space, which is more stringent, since 3 handbreadths of it would render the sukkah unfit, be as stringent as unfit roofing, which renders the sukkah unfit only with 4 handbreadths of unfit roofing? And they said to me, if so, according to you, who said that the unfit roofing renders a sukkah unfit only with 4 cubits of unfit roofing, so the same question arises, just as if there was a sukkah with less than 4 cubits of unfit roofing and an adjacent space measuring less than 3 handbreadths, what would be its status? It would be fit. Right? If you had the curved wall, because you had, let's say, less than 4 cubits of unfit roofing adjacent to the wall of the sukkah, so that's like the curved wall, and then you had a gap before the actual skak, the roofing of the sukkah begins, which is less than 3 handbreadths. Now, before the roofing starts, it's actually more than 4 cubits away from the wall. But if it really is a curved wall, well, then the wall reaches to here. And then if it's less than 3 handbreadths gap, then that principle of lavud that would join the roof to the wall would render it fit. And this would be a fit sukkah, right? And so they're saying to Rabbah, and we all agree that that's a fit sukkah. But according to you, who say these things combine, empty space and unfit roofing, you would combine those two things and it would be more than 4 cubits of unfit roofing attached to the wall, and that should render the sukkah unfit. But we don't make that decree because we don't join unfit roofing and empty space to form them, to come up with the requisite minimum to render this thing unfit. And I said to them, Rabbah said to them, what is this comparison? Granted, according to my opinion, that I say that the measure of unfit roofing that renders a sukkah is 4 cubits, the status of the sukkah is determined on the basis of whether it is the requisite measure or not the requisite measure. In other words, the difference between unfit roofing that is 4 cubits and unfit roofing that is less is a unique law in its own right about the curved wall, a completely unrelated to the principle. Oh, I'm sorry, he says, in other words, the difference between unfit roofing that is 4 cubits and unfit roofing that is less is a unique halacha completely unrelated to the principle of a curved wall. I don't understand that. Similarly, it is a unique halacha that 3 handbreadths of space in a roof render a sukkah unfit. In this case, there is not the requisite. Yeah, I think there's a misprint here. The 4 cubits is about the curved wall. The 3 handbreadths gap, that's a completely unrelated halacha, which has to do with lavud and whether we bridge that empty space or not. Since these are 2 different laws, we don't combine them into one to give to issue a ruling. That's what Rabbah is saying. However, according to you, Rabbah is saying, who say that the measure of 4 handbreadths for unfit roofing is due to the distance between the wall and the fit roofing, which renders the sukkah unfit. What is the difference to me if it was distance due to unfit roofing? And what is the difference to me if it was distance due to a combination of unfit roofing and space? In either case, the distance between the roofing and the wall should prevent connecting the roofing to the wall. And this concludes Rabbah's account of his exchange with the sages of the school of Rav. Abaye said to Rabbah, after he finished telling his story about that encounter, Abaye said, well, and according to the master too, meaning according to you, although their measures are not equal, in a large sukkah, which is larger than 4 cubits, and in a small sukkah, according to you, although their measures are not equal in a large sukkah, which is larger than 4 cubits, in a small sukkah, aren't their measures equal? In a minimum, in a tiny, like we have tiny houses, so in a tiny sukkah is just enough for one person to get his head and his upper body and be able to eat a little something in the sukkah, right? And in times of danger, people have used such tiny sukkahs so they can fulfill the obligation. So in a minimally sized sukkah, which is 7 by 7 handbreadths, right? It's like a cubit is usually about 5 handbreadths. So this is just larger than a cubit and a little more, right? So in a minimally sized sukkah, that's 7 by 7 handbreadths, 3 handbreadths of unfit roofing must render the sukkah unfit. If the measure of fitness were to remain up to 4 handbreadths, that would mean that a sukkah with a majority of unfit roofing is fit, which is unreasonable. Therefore, Rabbah's contention that the measures of unfit roofing and space are totally different is not so precise. There is a connection. Well, Rabbah said to him, there, in the case of the tiny sukkah, the fact that the sukkah is unfit is not due to the fact that their measures are equal. Rather, it is due to the fact that in the case where the unfit roofing is 3 handbreadths, the sukkah lacks the minimum required measure of fit roofing. In other words, it's not the amount of unfit roofing that creates the problem. Rather, it is that the fit area of the sukkah is too small for you to be under the roofing so you can fulfill your obligation. There's not enough roofing there for you to fulfill your obligation. You need 7 handbreadths. Rabbah maintains that since the 2 requisite measures of unfitness are not equal, they do not join together. So the Gemara asks, and anywhere that their measures are not equal, do they not combine to constitute the requisite measure? But didn't we learn in the Mishna that a garment must be at least 3 by 3 handbreadths in order to become a primary source of ritual impurity by means of the ritual impurity imparted by the treading of a zav? So somebody who's had a certain kind of emission, If they sit on a garment, on a cloth, they're going to render it tameh, ritually impure, and capable of transmitting that impurity to the next object which that cloth touches, let's say food. But sackcloth made from goat's hair must be at least 4 by 4 handbreadths, and animal hide must be 5 by 5, and a mat for sleeping must be 6 by 6. So there, what they're talking about in another tractate is that for a cloth to be susceptible to ritual impurity, it has to be a utensil of some sort. In other words, it has to have a utility. It has to be useful to people. And certain kinds of cloth or hide, smaller than a certain amount, it's not really useful for anything, and so it's just nil. It's not a utensil, and it cannot become ritually impure for that reason. So the sages in that other tractate define what are the minimum measures for a garment to be susceptible to ritual impurity, right? And their comparisons are like this. Sackcloth must be at least 4 by 4 handbreadths. Animal hide, 5 by 5, and a mat for sleeping, 6 by 6. That's the minimum amount of that kind of material, soft material, for it to become ritually impure. And there was a Baraisa taught concerning that Mishnah that the garment and the sackcloth and the hide and the mat join together with one another. If one attaches a piece of material that has a smaller, more stringent measure for ritual impurity to a piece of material that has a larger and more lenient measure, the combined cloth is susceptible to contract ritual impurity together if they compose at least the larger measure. So in other words, if you had, right, and a piece of garment was just 3 by 3 handbreadths, that's basically a rag, right? That's when you cut up a t-shirt, the only thing that's going to be useful to it is to make a rag, and a rag has to be at least 3 by 3 handbreadths, like the size of a handkerchief, in order to be useful. Whereas animal hide, it has to be 5 by 5 handbreadths, right? So if it's less than 5 by 5, it can't become ritually impure. But if for some reason you sewed this 2 by 2 handbreadth, rag that isn't really useful for anything, it's not a minimum measure for impurity, but you took that 2 by 2 handbreadth, strip of garment and sewed it to the animal hide, which let's say was 4 by 4, again, less than the minimum measure for animal hide. Now you've got something that's 6 handbreadths across, and even though it's made of 2 things which are too small in themselves to become ritually impure, now that you've attached them together, if they're sat on by a zav, if they come into contact with that source of ritual impurity, they will become ritually impure and are capable of transmitting that ritual impurity to the next thing that they touch. So therefore, given that law of things which have different minimum measures, and they can be combined in order to fulfill the minimum measure in combination, we go back to Rabba's question: why not combine empty space in the roof of a sukkah with unfit roofing in the roof of a sukkah, and say that if those 2 things are adjacent to each other, the minimum, the empty space and the unfit roofing, and although each one individually is less than the minimum measure to render the sukkah unfit, now that they're adjacent to each other, perhaps they will combine and render the sukkah unfit. That's the question. And where does the law end up? And I'm almost done now, so get your questions and comments in. So where does the law end up on this? 3 handbreadths of unroofed space render a sukkah unfit, both in the middle of the sukkah and along the side of the sukkah, if the space runs along the whole length of the sukkah. If the space in the roofing is less than 3 handbreadths, the sukkah is fit, and the space can be factored into the calculation of the area of the sukkah, although one may not sleep beneath it, right? That empty space, if it's a tiny sukkah, it's going to add into the calculation of how big the sukkah is. But when you're under the gap, you're not fulfilling your obligation. You want to be under proper roofing. So the minimum measure, if you reach 3 handbreadths, it renders the sukkah unfit. If it's less than 3 handbreadths, it's not going to render the sukkah unfit. If 4 cubits of unfit roofing on the side of the sukkah run along the length of the entire sukkah, meaning they're adjacent to the wall, or if there are 4 handbreadths of unfit roofing in the middle of the sukkah is unfit, right? So unfit roofing, you can have a little bit more of it in the middle than was the maximum measure of just an empty space, up to 4 handbreadths. Or if it's along the wall, up to 4 cubits, a much greater length, but that's because of the principle of the curved wall. That only works at the wall, not in the middle of the roof, in the middle of the sukkah. If the unfit roofing measures less than 4 handbreadths, the sukkah is fit, and one may even sleep beneath it, like the board in the roof. All of these measurements apply to a large sukkah. However, in the case of a small sukkah, whose area is a bit more than 7 by 7 handbreadths, 3 handbreadths of unfit roofing renders the sukkah unfit. So you don't even need 4 handbreadths of unfit roofing to render a tiny sukkah unfit. Even 3 handbreadths of unfit roofing will do it. If there are less than 3 handbreadths of unfit roofing, it is factored into the calculation of the area of the sukkah, and one may sleep beneath it. What if they're adjacent to each other? Rabba's question. In a case where there are less than 4 handbreadths of unfit roofing and less than 3 handbreadths of space adjacent to it, the sukkah is fit, as the two do not combine to render the sukkah unfit. However, in a small sukkah, if the two measure 3 handbreadths, they do combine and they render the sukkah unfit because there is a lack of enough fit roofing to fulfill your obligation in the tiny sukkah. So at the end of the day, even though we can combine, like a rag of wool or linen or something together with animal hide to have the minimum measure for a textile, as it were, that can contract ritual impurity, we don't combine the empty space with the unfit roofing because they're just different enough concepts that, as we see, they don't combine together. Okay, let's go to comments and questions. Yosef, is there a kosher way to build a sukkah on your balcony if you live in an apartment building? Right. So there are definitely sukkahs that are built on balconies, and you see them in Israel all the time. However, the buildings where sukkahs are found on balconies are often designed to be, buildings where people build sukkahs on balconies. What is the issue? If the balcony in the apartment above yours is going to be over your roof, right? And so the majority of the sunlight that would come into your sukkah and be stopped by your own schach, by the roofing of your sukkah, is in fact stopped by the balcony above yours, then that would render your sukkah unfit. It's like building a sukkah inside the house. So, but if you don't have somebody else's balcony over yours, then definitely you can do that. Or if the balcony above yours is far enough above that sunlight can get in and strike your roofing, then it will also work. It's a case-by-case basis, and you really have to, get a rabbi to look at it. Even with a photograph of the building, you could submit it to a rabbi who could probably tell you, but that would be better if he was able to visit. That's my understanding of it. I am definitely not an expert in the law of sukkahs. Lynn, would a leather billfold be a utensil, though it is smaller than the measure of that? What amount of leather can transmit tumah? What a good question. I think yes. I didn't read the whole daf today, but it did talk about that even at 1 handbreadth by 1 handbreadth, a garment can transmit a piece of cloth or whatever, or hide, can transmit tumah if it was cut to be that size, right? So even though the leather billfold is less than that minimum amount, it is definitely a utensil because it was cut to serve a purpose as a wallet. And so since it's cut to be a utensil, it is a utensil, and I believe that it can receive and transmit tumah. And finally, Pam Simmons says, just a random question. What if a person lives in an apartment without a balcony or access to outside? How can a person honor the mitzvah have the honor to build a sukkah, or honor the law and build a sukkah? So it's a really good question. It's a really good question. Again, that's going to be a case-by-case basis. Maybe you get lucky and you can find a piece of sidewalk where no one will tell you to remove the sukkah, right? And I think it's a true story and not a joke, or maybe it was told as a joke. And this is where Nina would say, Sal, stop. Do not tell a joke if you're not sure if you're going to tell it right. But I'm going to forge ahead anyway. Let me see if I can remember this properly. But, there was somebody had this situation and they didn't have a place to build a sukkah. And so they built it, I don't know if in front of the building or on the roof of the building, but the landlord didn't like it, and so the landlord said, take it down. And the person says, I'm not going to take it down. I have to fulfill my obligation for Sukkot. And so the landlord takes this person to court, the small claims court, and says it's outrageous. They built this sukkah on the sidewalk in front of the building or on the roof. I can't remember which. And it must be taken down. There's no legal right to do this. And the judge, who understood how important this mitzvah was to this person who has no access to a sukkah any other way, and learned about the laws of Sukkot and that it's an 8-day holiday, issued a ruling and said, the landlord is right. You don't have a right to build that sukkah. It must be taken down, and I hereby order you to take down that sukkah within 8 days of my ruling. So the person was able to keep the sukkah. But yeah, you see them in Manhattan, definitely, sort of sidewalk sukkahs and rooftop sukkahs. So it's like you just have to, if possible, find a place. And if you just can't find a place where you can build it and leave it there and it'll be undisturbed, then, at least try to find someone who will invite you to go eat in their sukkah, or worst case, find a kosher restaurant, which usually will have a sukkah, in front or in back during the holiday, and you'll be able to at least have a few meals and fulfill the obligation of dwelling in a sukkah. When you eat a meal in a sukkah, you say the blessing, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to dwell in the sukkah. When you eat in the sukkah, you're actually fulfilling the commandment to dwell in the sukkah. So at least you can do that. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us this evening. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. A big shkoyach to you. May you be strengthened to keep learning, just as you've started your week by learning late on a Saturday night. So may you continue to learn all the days of your life and live to 120. All the best.